Were you on when I shouted out Camp Newman during something I said yesterday?
I don't think so, because I know I had to jump off at right around the time that you were going.
No, that's okay. No, nothing personal. I just want you to know that I shouted out Camp Newman.
There was
Well,
something
actually, Twig and Newman.
I was on one call yesterday where all of us were wearing Camp Newman suits. Like of 10 people, 4 were wearing Camp Newman.
Well, Daryl, I still have a pair of Camp Swig boxer shorts from the 70s. On one of the Zoom calls, I'll wear them and stand up, maybe.
Good morning.
We'll take your word for it.
Okay, we are live. So I think we're going to hand over to Rabbi Jack Luxembourg.
Bruchim Habaim. Welcome to the Zionist Beit Midrash. I'm Rabbi Jack Luxembourg, Vice Chairperson of ARZENU, and the Merakez, the coordinator for the Zionist Beit Midrash. Today we will learn with 3 outstanding teachers. Dr. Andrew Rayfeld, President of the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, only the 10th to hold that position in the 144-year history of the institution. Rabbi Talia Avnon Ben-Venisti, Director of the Israel Rabbinical Program at the Hebrew Union College campus in Jerusalem, responsible for training the leaders of our Israeli movement. And Rabbi Michael Marmer, Associate Professor of Jewish Theology at the Hebrew Union College campus in Jerusalem, and if you don't mind my giving you a plug, Rabbi, co-editor of the recently published book, American Jewish Thought Since 1934. Each presenter is an accomplished academic, a thoughtful scholar, a creative thinker, and a lifelong Zionist who has joined us today in order to help us think about what is Reform Zionism. To do so, each will present a favorite Zionist text, which he or she has found instructive, insightful, and inspiring. After each brief presentation, we will have an opportunity to break into small discussion groups to share our reactions and perspectives with each other. This is a rare opportunity for Reform Zionists from around the world to engage each other in discussion. These breakout groups will be generated randomly, and those who were good enough to agree to be discussion leaders, I'm going to ask you to please remain in the main room with us after the breakout groups are created so that we can assign you to your respective groups. After about 15 to 18 minutes of conversation, we will reconvene for a summation and, if time allows, for final thoughts from our presenters. So let's begin. Each presentation will be 10 minutes in length, and our teachers will present in the historical order of the text that they have chosen. So we will hear first from Rabbi Avnon Ben-Venisti, followed by Rabbi Marmer, and Acharon Chaviv from Dr. Rayfeld. And friends, since these quotes are all part of the broad Torah of the Jewish people, let's begin our study with the appropriate bracha. Join me if you will. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen v'amen. And now we begin with teaching from Rabbi Avnon Ben-Venisti.
Thank you. Every nation has a story to tell, and every imagined communities share dreams that dissolve into deeds. Many of us may not remember the following name, but are likely to be familiar with the story. Friedrich Löwenberg, a young and educated Jewish professional, embarks on a bizarre journey headed for a life cut off from civilization in Africa, accompanied by an elderly man who is a devout Christian. The year is 1902. The days are the days of glory for Europe. Western culture is celebrating its accomplishments, but many young people are chasing after its promises in vain. In the wake of modernity, many of Friedrich's contemporaries find themselves disenchanted by the system that deceived them. They're unable to make a living, and just like today, they're being led towards a life lacking purpose and are fighting for their future and losing hope for their lives. Like them, Friedrich is also wandering aimlessly on the streets of the grand modern city of Vienna, brokenhearted after being rejected by the love of his life, who married someone else. While desperately searching for a job in the classified section of the newspaper, he suddenly comes across a strange ad that catches his eyes. According to the ad, an elderly man who is a devout Christian is looking for a despairing young man to be his travel companion on a sea voyage to Africa. Someone who, like him, wants to find an alternative to the comfort of Western life in Europe on the African continent. Friedrich answers the ad and in an agitated state sets out on this insane journey. While the two are sailing on the open sea, and as a gesture towards the young Jew who agreed to leave his life behind, the Christian man asked the captain to dock in Palestine so the Jew can have a look at the life of his people in the land of the Jews. The encounter between the young Jew from Vienna and the Jews living in Palestine rocked Friedrich's more than an unsteady ship at the sea, and the soul of the young man became intertwined with the soul of the country. Since those days when the ship docked on the sand dunes at the ancient port of Jaffa, the history of the Jewish people has changed beyond recognition. But Friedrich was never a real person. He was created in a utopian novel published in the beginning of the 20th century. But thanks to the description of the life journey he took, the Jewish people also set out of one of its greatest missions. Friedrich Löwenberg's fictional life has and will remain with us forever in Theodor Herzl's book, Altneuland. The book has a tremendous impact on the history of our people and on the personal and family biographies of each and every one of us. Without Friedrich and the person who created him, Theodor Herzl, Jewish history as we know it today would be very different, and our life would contain very different details. Through Friedrich, Herzl wanted to change the future for the Jewish people, the day of judgment of European Jewry. He wanted to set their life on a new course and give them hope, strength, and spirit in the new land. Since then, and up to the present, the Jewish state has become the greatest project undertaken by the Jewish people in modern times. The beating heart of the nation, the nerve center of the people. Everything that happens in Israel comes with a high degree of tension and evokes powerful emotions. But it's also a place where the spirit soars, where the soul sings a whole and complete Jewish Israeli song. Since its establishment, the state of Israel has symbolized another dramatic change in the life of the Jewish people. Despite its mission to gather in all the Jews of the world, Israel has never been close to achieving that. Also, for many people, it still remains a distant and foreign land. But as a place that is real, alive, and kicking, Israel has marked the beginning of a new era in the hearts of Jews. The search for a common, renewed identity. Israel's presence in the Jewish world has totally transformed it. And from a dream, the Jewish state has become a reality. And from a fictional utopia, a biting actuality. It has also gone from putting the state interests first to eternal divisions, and from identification to tough questions about identity, from a brotherly covenant to a blood covenant. Whereas in the past, it was born from the messianic message of redemption and the end of days, today Israel is at a crossroad that will determine its future role in history. So what does the future hold in store for Israel? And what does the future hold in store for the covenant between the Jewish people? We turn to the last page of Alt Neuland to find out. So if we can share now the quote from Alt Neuland. This is the very last words that Theodor Herzl writes in his book. At last, Friedrich put a question, and every man answered it after his fashion. We see a new and happy form of human society here, he said. What created it? Necessity, said Litwak, the elder. The reunited people, said Steinach, the architect. The new means of transportation, said King's Court. Knowledge, said Dr. Marcus. Willpower, said Joe Levy. The force of nature, said Professor Steinach. Mutual toleration, said Reverend Mr. Hopkins. Self-confidence, said Resking Bay. Love and pain, said David Litwak. But the venerable Rabbi Samuel arose and proclaimed God. And now, dear book, after 3 years of labor, we must part. And your suffering will begin. You will have to make your way through enmity and disrepresentation as through a dark forest. When, however, you come among friendly folks, give them greetings from your Father. Tell them that he believes dreams are also a fulfillment of the days of our sojourn on earth. Dreams are not so different from deeds as some may think. All the deeds of men are only dreams at first, and in the end, their deeds dissolve into dreams. Just like then to nowadays, Israel is trying to find its way. Israel is a new and a young project. It is soft and fragile like a newborn baby, and it's also bold self-confidence and burst of energy like an adolescence. But its best years are still ahead of it. Israel's future rests on the scale of history. Another 2,000 years of creativity are awaiting our country, and 3 million Jews worldwide are entrusted with that future. We have a great story to tell. So what will our deeds be that will dissolve into our old and new dreams? Thank you.
I guess it's me. Thank you, Talia. I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking to you and bringing to light a quotation from Judah Leon Magnus. Who was he? Was he a Zionist, and was he Reform? These are the three questions we all want to know. Who was he? He was born in 1877. He died a few short months after the declaration, after the establishment of the State of Israel. He died in October of 1948. Born in San Francisco, raised in Oakland, moved to Cincinnati, spent significant time in Berlin and other parts of Germany during his doctoral work, back to the States, where he had a number of key roles in the city of New York. He was a rabbi at Temple Emmanuel. I had great fun some years ago teaching one of Judah Magnus's very fiery sermons to the congregants of Emmanuel at Temple Emmanuel. And it was interesting to see how the decades, what difference the decades had made. It ends, by the way, that great sermon, it was from Passover 19 something, I can't remember exactly the year, by saying, you, the congregants of Temple Emmanuel, you need to decide, are you serious about your Judaism? Are you committed to Jewish renewal and Jewish culture? Or are you just kind of wishy-washy? Well, I'm pleased to report the congregants of Temple Emmanuel did decide, and Rabbi Magnus's tenure at that temple ended shortly after he gave the sermon. In New York, he maintained a number of positions, and if you're interested in the JCC movement and its precursor, something called the Kehillah movement, that's Magnus. He was there right at the very beginning. The Joint, the JDC, very involved in setting it up. A little congregation somewhere on the Upper West Side called BJ, B'nai Jeshurun, he was a rabbi there too. He has a remarkable story to tell. All this he had achieved, having completed his studies, I mentioned Cincinnati, at the Hebrew Union College. He originally, Dr. Rayfeld, was thinking of staying as librarian at the college, but he had difficult relations with the president and ended up not doing so. After New York in the early 1920s, in 1922, he finds his way to Palestine. He takes on key roles, both as president and chancellor of the Hebrew University. He is a crucial figure in the establishment of that keystone cultural institution of the nascent of the Yishuv and then of the State of Israel. And he's also involved in a number of what we would call today peace movements, which are on the edge or beyond the pale of the Zionist consensus. He dies, as I've mentioned, just a few short months after the establishment of the state during a visit to New York. He dies in New York with feelings of great ambivalence at the establishment of the state, which leads us to my second question. Was he, what kind of Zionist was he? Does he have a right to be included in a Zionist Beit Midrash? In the essay, a small quotation from which we're going to look at in a minute, earlier on in that essay, he relates to that question and says that a number of his friends say of him, and this is his voice now, although I live in Zion, I am not a Zionist at all, they claim. Then he says in typically, what's the word I'm looking for, trenchant fashion, I wonder where the ecclesiastic authority as to who is and who is not a Zionist rests. At any rate, the company of the band is varied and long, band, B-A-N-E-D, that's what he's referring to. And if I remember right, it at times even includes some of the faithful themselves. In other words, if I am to be placed beyond the pale by those who hold the torch for Zionist purity, that's not bad company to be in. Perhaps, he says, these friends are right. Maybe what I'm talking about is not Zionism, but even they will admit that it is the undying traditional chibat Zion, the love of Zion. What is it that makes Magnus such a controversial figure in the story of Zionism? It is that he is far away from what we might call political Zionism, the machinations of state building. That is far away. Herzl, who we just heard about from Talia, is not his hero. Rather, it's Herzl's counterpart, Achad Ha'am, the traditions of cultural Zionism, which most inspire Magnus. And Magnus has grave reservations about what the future holds if we are fated here in this land to be in a constant dance of death with the Arab peoples who also live here. Now, was he Reform? Well, he clearly was Reform and ordained by our institution, a leader in our movement, but highly critical. He was somebody who I think would have been highly critical of any institution or framework that he was part of. That was part of his DNA. He, by the way, regarded that as a key element of the finest traditions of reform. He thought that being constantly critical and self-critical was essential for what it meant to advance the notion of reform. He clearly was reform if what one means by that term is committed to the notion of an unfolding, developing, historically rooted sense of Judaism, inspired and informed by the traditions of the prophets. He's rather sniffy, or whatever the right word is, about certain kinds of institutional reform, which he thinks is too static. In 1930, Magnus publishes a little pamphlet called Like All the Nations, question mark. And in that pamphlet, he includes this paragraph, which now by magic, as if by magic, should appear on the screen. 3 great things, he writes, this poor little land has already given Israel in 2 generations. Hebrew, number 1, has become a living possession and has thus restored to us and our children the sources of our history and our mind, and has thus given us the medium again for classic, permanent Jewish expression. The second great thing is the return of the Jews to the soil, not only for the sake of a living from the soil, but also for the sake of their love of this particular soil and its indissoluble connection with the body of the Jewish people. Third, the brave attempt on the part of city-bred, school-bred young Jews, moderns of the modern, to work out in life, in the cities and on the land, a synthesis between the radicalism of their social outlook and their ancestral Judaism. It is problems of the same nature that a whole world in travail is laboring to solve. And among Jewry, no more splendid attempt at a synthesis has been made than here, in everyday life, and not in theory alone. What are the 3 things that in 1930, 18 years before the establishment of the state, what has the nascent Zionist movement already wrought? A revolution with regard to Hebrew, the revivification of the Hebrew language, the return to a particular place on the map with all the implications that that has for what Magnus calls the body of the Jewish people, and the return of Jews educated in a certain milieu, their commitment to try and work out a synthesis between their social outlook and their ancestral Judaism. This is at the heart of what you might call Magnus's progressive, yes, Zionist vision. If you come back to me for the final stirring peroration. What do we have here? We have a one-off, not somebody who followed the herd, somebody who represents, in my view, an aspect of our reform identity that sometimes we have let slip, a radical voice, an unsettling voice, a contentious voice, which became most associated in his lifetime with the question of whether we as Jews on this soil are destined to be constantly relying on what he called our bayonets, our weapons, or whether it's possible to imagine a future for this enterprise of reviving Hebrew and the Jewish people and the synthesis, which finds another source, another relationship with those who surround us. All of us on this call, I'm sure, are aware that there was a somewhat wildly utopian nature to Magnus's outlook and approach. But that said, at this stage of the Zionist movement and at this stage of our history, there is indeed renewed interest in those voices within the Reform conversation and the Zionist conversation which may not have been center stage, voices which we ignore at our peril, voices which call us to reconsider what Reform Zionism might look like, must look like as we go forward. Here's my final sentence. It's not mine. It's from Magnus himself, the end of that booklet, which I was quoting from earlier. He says, when we go to our Jewish homeland, it is by an act of will, of faith, of free choice. And we should not either will or believe in or want a Jewish home that can be maintained in the long run only against the violent opposition of the Arab and Muslim peoples. Sadly, as we found out, it wasn't only up to us to decide that, but nonetheless, this is his vision. The fact is that they are here in their overwhelming numbers in this part of the world. And whereas it may have been in accord with Israelite needs in the time of Joshua to conquer the land and maintain their position with the sword, this is not in accord with the desire of plain Jews, or with, and these are his final words, the long ethical tradition of Judaism that has not ceased developing to this day.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Marmer, for that stirring and inspiring talk, and Rabbi Avnon as well. My quote today jumps a few decades into Israel's founding document, the Declaration of Independence. And the reason I want to focus on it is it captures so much of what to me is the spirit of Zionism that we can take even to today. I'm going to do this by navigating what declarations of independence do and are, and particularly pull a quote from the middle of it, the very famous quote of paragraph 13, not yet, but in just a moment, to talk about what the legacy of the declaration is for us today. So the first thing to note about the declaration is that its establishment, its declaring, its publication, demonstrated that political Zionism had won. The kind of Zionism that Herzl was perhaps the most famous early promoter of, not the only, but perhaps the most famous, but not Magnus's Zionism, as Rabbi Marmer had described. Nor was there any doubt by 1948 that political Zionism had won. That point really had been won a few decades before. But the declaration provided the exclamation point on a process that had begun about 75 years before. Zionism would be and does mean the creation of Jewish sovereignty as an independent state within a specific land. So if you look at the process of the Israeli Declaration of Independence, of any nation's independence, their origins can in some way tell you the character of a nation that's founding it. Think about the United States. The document was written by a committee of 5, primarily by Thomas Jefferson, and then edited mostly through deletions by the entire Second Continental Congress over a 2-day period. It was then approved by 12 of the 13 delegations of the Congress with no opposition votes. New York would abstain, and signed by virtually all of the delegates after approval. It thus reflected in America what Tocqueville would describe as the spirit of America, one of self-interest properly understood. That is, the idea that individuals could be interested in their self by working for the collective and in collaboration with their communities. In Israel's case, the drafting reflected more of the bureaucratic and contentious nature of the Jewish people. There was an initial draft that went through at least 2 separate committees with more than a dozen people having some hand in writing it. And then when the vote was taken with some urgency as the British mandate was ending, it barely passed with only 6 of the 10 members present in favor, and with 3 members not attending for reasons of the conflict. It was ultimately signed by the leadership of the Yishuv, but it represented a tension within the politics of the moment. Of course, as a substantive matter, declarations of independence seldom create binding laws of a new nation, but the content of their words are and must be read as expressions of the core principles of a nation expressed for political purposes. That is, you can never read a Declaration of Independence and take from it only the moral character. You also have to understand it was for a particular purpose. And so they're meant not just to express ideals, but to persuade, to motivate, and to say to external observers, we are independent and we insist that you recognize as such. Because of that, they are both idealistic and very practical documents, and once created, the political motivations of the document often recede from collective memory, and what's left are the ideals that stick with us. And those ideals help craft our own self-perception as a national entity, which is why they become, as a crafting document, so important. Think again about the United States. We remember the second sentence with its aspirational language. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, written by a slave owner. And right, the political side, we remember the ideal. And we don't so readily recall that most of the Declaration of Independence in America is taken up by a set of grievances, a long list, against King George, or that the choice to declare would mean, in the American case, that reconciliation with the crown would not be an option. And so too in Israel's case. Remember, this was signed just as the British were about to end their mandate and enter a fight between the Jews and the Arabs that was already intense and intensifying. The opposition favored, that is, who opposed it, favored an American ceasefire. They weren't against founding a Jewish state. It was a question of political timing. The question put to them was, should we declare or accept a truce with a decidedly uncertain outcome? Of note is how much was left unsaid in the document. It was more a declaration of independence of a people than perhaps of a state. While it located the nation in the land of Israel, for example, it explicitly deleted references to the contentious issues of borders that still divided factions from within the leadership. There's famously no mention of God in any conventional sense, though the idea of a rock of the people or of the nation was seen as a compromise position. The declaration created the first public statement and decision of what the name of the state would be. It would be Israel, not Judea or Zion or some other that were floated. And what did remain took on more significance as an idealistic document, particularly in the absence of an expected but never realized Israeli constitution. And portions of it, particularly from paragraph 13, would become part of Israel's basic law in the 1990s, assuring human rights for all citizens. And this is the quote that I want to look at right now in that famous paragraph. So if you could put up the quote, thank you. Let me open my screen so I can actually read the quote. The state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and the ingathering of the exiles. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all of its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace, as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions, and it will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. And note the specific and the particular as well as the universal. And yes, don't forget this is a political document, and having it here does express political purposes for people to be, have some confidence in the administration of the state. But it nevertheless contains some very core ideals that were baked into this founding document. Okay, you can take that down now. So most important to me, and the reason that I chose this quote, is that I believe that the Declaration of Independence provides a moral basis for any nation's existence, but in particular for Israel's. And this is a very important point that has sometimes get lost in the propaganda and popular press. The basis and justification of Israel's existence is often stated as a normalization ideal. That is, that the idea that the Jews have the right to enjoy what every other people in history has enjoyed, the right to have their own states and their own lands. I'm sure you've heard of this. Maybe some of you actually accept that. While it might be a good soundbite, it simply is not true. The math will show this. There are over 4,000 identified distinct peoples in the world. There are fewer than 200 sovereign nations, nor are the largest and most powerful nations based on a singular people. They are based on collections of people that form in a union for government protection, whether the United States, Germany, India, all prominent examples. And these are examples where states are formed to protect people and persons in all of their diversity, even though once created, a dominant culture will arise and over time will create a new people, if you will, over the centuries. The Israeli Declaration of Independence becomes much more than just a political document. It does no less than provide the moral basis for placing the devastating power of state sovereignty into the hands of a definable and distinct and discernible people. And the document does this by stating clearly what the principles of Zionism would carry with it, that the state of Israel would be founded on three core ideals. Number one, the security and defense of the Jewish people. Number two, the flourishing of Jewish culture, including but not limited to religion, and limiting the use of state power to secure those ends by the principles of universal justice and human rights, taken from that paragraph we just read. Zionism, in my view, thus emerges as something that embraces not just the protective purposes, nor the promotion of Jewish flourishing for its own sake, but the negative and positive are conditioned by the pursuit of justice for all. And so the declaration thus expresses that the moral spirit of the Zionist movement is not one of xenophobia and partiality, not in its truest sense. It is designed not only to protect a people who have suffered the worst abuses of history, but to deepen the richness of Judaism free from prejudice and threat. And along with that negative and positive, most importantly, it expresses a commitment to a flourishing of Judaism and nationalism, not merely for its own sake. Rather, the declaration establishes Zionism as a movement of human liberation, meant to bring dignity, meaning, and purpose to our own lives as Jews in service to our shared universal ideals of the good and the holy, the beautiful and the true, the ethical, the right, and the just for all peoples of the world. Thank you.
I think, Rabbi Jack, you might be on mute. Couldn't be a Zoom session without someone being on mute at one point.
I can keep talking if that would be helpful.
I think that we could continue to listen to not only Dr. Rayfeld, but to Rabbis Marmer and Avnom Ben-Vinisti for some time. But it's also important for us to pause, reflect, react, and share with each other. So at this point, we're going to break and we're going to go into our breakout rooms, and we'll stay there until 8:55. And then we'll bring everyone back together for a brief summation. That will give us about 15, let's see, it's 8:40. Will give us about 15 minutes in our groups. Please, again, be patient. We're going to break everybody out to the group. If you're invited into a room, please click yes. And for those who are discussion leaders, please remain in the main room to be assigned. Thank you very much to our tech crew for making this possible. We'll reconvene at 8:55.
Wonderful. This seems to be working. Have our facilitators already been assigned the right groups? Tech team?
Yes, the facilitators have been assigned so they can go to their breakout rooms.
Perfect.
Now.
So if you click yes.
So are we now together on the stream for those who are not entering breakout groups?
Yeah, I think it would be wonderful if there are a few more people who are being assigned breakout groups who have not yet left, but I think they can either press assign, go to their assigned group, or they can just join us as well. Thank you so much.
All right, well, with thanks to our tech crew and thank you to those who are remaining here in the main room with our presenters for the next few minutes. And I do have a question I'd like to pose to our presenters, and hope that they'll respond in the time that we have allotted, and we can then generate some conversation amongst ourselves. I'm wondering, since we have three wonderful quotes from three very distinct phases of the Zionist enterprise, what do you think the authors of your quotes would think of the other two? How would they have reacted? For example, what do you think Herzl would have thought of Magnus and the Israeli Declaration of Independence? What would Magnus have, if we can tell, and maybe we know more about that, what did Magnus think of Herzl? And we do know, I imagine, what he thought about the Declaration of Independence, and we'd like to know that. And I'm wondering, Dr. Rehfeld, if you could imagine what some of the framers of the Declaration of Independence thought, and I'm sure that thought was varied, of Herzl's vision and Magnus's brand of Zionism. And maybe who would like to jump in?
I'd encourage Rabbi Avnon, if you want to go back through history, because it's sort of, it would seem just, but I don't want to put you on the spot.
I'm still taking my time to reflect, so please.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think the historic judgment of Herzl looking back is that in some ways he was enhanced by his early decline, by his early death. He had proven himself to be a latecomer to Zionism, even to embracing the Jewish people. But once he got on it, and I think he would have ultimately been undone by it, was his political pragmatism, you know, looking for any number of ways to proceed. But the ideas that he left behind, I have to say, I think are perfectly embodied in the Declaration of Independence, at least conditioned by some political realities, but not overly politically pragmatic. There's a reason that his picture was hung, you know, right there in the signing, that famous portrait, because I do think that they self-consciously embraced that. And I would also say that to those who were forms of other kind of Zionisms, whether Magnus's or other ones, there was a sense at that time, as I understand it, of the evolution. So you have cultural Zionists, I mean, Achat Ha'am is the best example, who started firmly against the idea of a state that came across and adopted it. And through the 30s, you see this in the Reform movement, where there was a lot of resistance, but with the atrocities of the Holocaust and with the reality of the state on the ground, came around to it. So I would say maybe this is overly ideal, but there was a sense of charitability to the unfolding process and nature of political Zionism emerging as the best and the only alternative.
Rabbi Marmor, I'm wondering if you can put yourself back into the shoes of Dr. Magnus and reflect on this as well.
Well, Magnus had been, we know, had been stirred by Herzl. Actually, already in the 1890s, before Herzl called the Zionist Congress, Magnus had published a pamphlet called Palestine or Death. So he was pretty much there at the heart of that enterprise, and became convinced that Zionism, I think there's somewhere, I'm not a Magnus expert, our colleague David Barak Gorodetsky, a graduate of our Israeli rabbinic program, wrote a great book about Magnus, and can tell you what Magnus had for lunch every day. I'm afraid I'm not, I'm an amateur in that regard, but I do recall, if I'm not mistaken, that he was very stirred by reading Alt Neuland. He was very taken up with the promise of the Zionist movement. But as I tried to say in my remarks, the path of political Zionism was not his path, and he was convinced that by ignoring what he considered to be the latent ethical challenges inherent in the political situation, Zionism was going to pay a heavy price. So he regarded it as inevitable. What he was writing, Palestine or Death, his main concern in the American Jewish scene was assimilation. He saw what he considered to be the perils of assimilation, and saw Zionism, the Jewish cultural renewal, as a contra to that risk or to that threat. With regards to the establishment of the state, there are some it's kind of touching his final months. He's in New York. I believe that Weizmann might have been there at the same time. There's a scene, I think, in which he shakes the hand of Weizmann at the Waldorf Astoria or some such thing, and says to his son, Magnus says to his son, you know, I don't want you to think that I'm not excited by this. He was stirred and moved by the establishment of the state, but he was also deeply, deeply concerned. Events such as the Deir Yassin massacre and so forth, he was exactly the kind of bleeding heart, self-hating Jewish Zionist liberal that everybody likes to pillory so much. And he did so unafraid to incur everybody's criticism. So it's interesting the way these three sources panned out. There is a continuum here. There is a continuum here. Maybe it speaks to the health and vigor of how Zionism was and how it's developed, that these voices could find some sort of a home. They were in relation to each other. I can say, from my perspective, as somebody who's chosen to live in, who lives here now, I think that the Zionist project is in crisis. You shouldn't feel bad. Everyone's in crisis, so you can feel good about that. But there is this crisis. Talia, Rabbi Avnon Levinisti referred to this. What's going to happen with all this promise and what happens next is something that we're all kind of struggling to work out. So yeah, Magnus, as somewhere placed in the middle of these sources, had relations both with Herzl before and with the declaration, which is more or less at the time of his demise.
He really is historically, he's very pivotal. He looks backwards and looks forward. And thank you for the analysis. I'm wondering, Rabbi Avnon Levinisti, if you would have a word or two to say. I was touched by the imagery of dreams at the end of the quote you chose, because we so often grasp onto the Im Tirtzu Ein Zo Agadah phraseology. If you will, it is no dream. And yet the last words of the book is very much connected to dreams waiting to be realized, dreams that are fulfilled. And then what happens, as I think Rabbi Marmer is suggesting, the question you posed in effect was, what happens to our dreams once they come to realization? Would you care to comment?
I live very close to Tel Aviv. I used to live in Tel Aviv for many years, and there is this graffiti that it's found in many different areas in the city. That's usually behind buildings or in between unseen corners, that is often seen by those who are looking for interesting spots in the city. And the quote has Theodor Herzl's profile, the face, and it says in Hebrew, "Lo rotzim, lo tzarich." Like, if you don't want this to happen, forget it. Something like this in a very sort of loose translation to English. And I want to say something about the question that we always try to look to reflect on history and say, what would Herzl think and what would Magnus think? And what happened to the Declaration of Israel? This was the foundation of the values of this country. What happened to the values and what happened to the country and what happened actually to this declaration? What ended? How does it end it to be so different? So I think when we think of ideas and we think of people who create ideas, and then there is a line of people that take these ideas and create deeds and are doers and not necessarily thinkers. I don't think that the only way to look at history is through this linkage of units that is connected one to the other, one is connected to what was before and to what is coming next. I think the metaphor that I would like to actually bring here is an explosion, that once the early thinkers of Zionism, when they envision the land of the Jews, they probably had it very different to what we experience it today. So I think, but once the idea was out there, it created an explosion that went through all different areas of understanding and translating those ideas and those dreams into reality. And this is Zionism as we understand that exists today. And it's not far from its origin. I think it's a different take from the original thinker back then. And I think if we're talking about Zionism in a political setting, because usually this is how we end up providing the context against or with Zionism discussions and learning. And I think because one of the problems of Zionism that we always put it today in a political setting and not in a different kind of setting. And one of the things we can do to help us is to release it from any kind of political talk or political learning settings, and to free it back to the world and see then what happens to Zionism in the next few decades of the land of the Jews and the land of Jewish people.
I think that's really lovely. As you were talking, I was reminded of one of the things that one of the young people, we had a session on Zionism today and tomorrow, I think 2 days ago, with a group of sort of people in their early 20s. And I think one of the things that they kept saying is that the challenge with Zionism is that it's only so many times only seen in the political context. And then on the whole, in the realities that they live in around the world, but on campus and also later life, it's seen as a right-wing endeavor nowadays. And that they really felt what we needed to recapture as Reform Zionists is this sense of what are actually the values of Zionism, not just the politics of Zionism, but the values of Zionism. So I think I will make sure that they'll listen to this part of the breakout group so that they'll hear it from you, because I think they will very much like that.
Thank you. I was wondering also from our presenters, what did you find meaningful in the quotes that the others chose? I mean, you're all familiar with them. I know. But they're also part of what I'll call the Zionist Torah, and you're all students of that Torah. So I'm wondering if any one of you would like to comment on the quotes chosen by the other.
I think I can relate to the Declaration of the State of Israel. Sometimes we put it in historical context and we look at it a text that was written in the past. I think there's also an opportunity for us to see it, to look at it as a prophecy. It's something for us to aim towards the future, not something that was, in the back of the creation of the Jewish state, but something that was put out there back then, and it also gave us the direction. It's a way for us to create the new, or maybe the same sort of Jewish map crossword that will define and direct us to the next few stages of Zionism and the Jewish state. It's not only a political and a legal statement, it's a prophecy. And I think we can relate it as just like the prophets gave us back then, the direction to our life, to our Jewish life, and to our moral life.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Rayfeld, Rabbi Marmer, would you like to comment?
I defer to my esteemed colleague.
Esteemed, or perhaps just steamed. I love the piece there in the Herzl where there's this debate. I don't think it's the finest literary effort you have whenever read. I don't think anybody could accuse Herzl of that. But this sort of novel of ideas in which the characters line up towards the end and give the list of what it is that's motivating this new, form of society. And one reads the list with a mixture of interest. There's a kind of a melancholy attached to it as well, and also how little, and so to some degree, things change. Is it necessity that drives us to this? This new experiment in human, organization, the people reuniting, the kind of force of will, the new means of transportation, that it's modernity and technology. I suppose today we would need to go beyond transportation and include, the electronic. If you just go down the list, it's actually a very fascinating catalog of trying to explain or get one's head round what all of these changes, stem from and what they mean. And with regards to the Declaration of Independence, our colleague David Ellenson is writing a little piece about the use of the Declaration of Independence in educational and other settings. an organization that I'm currently very involved with, Rabbis for Human Rights, we have educational materials that we teach in various settings, as do other institutions, in which that declaration is taught as kind of, don't want to say holy writ, but as a sort of foundational text, and trying to tease out what is and is not said in that statement. So I feel, close to both of those wonderful selections, and I find the kind of juxtaposition of the three interesting.
I would just confirm what both of my colleagues said. Rabbi, go ahead. We may be out of time now.
No, your time, Doctor.
Well, just to reflect as much on the people as anything else. I mean, you could not, in some ways, find two divergent and convergent other individuals that really wind up in my view, the Declaration. And I feel close to Magnus because of the connection to Hebrew Union College. But I also feel very close to Herzl because he's a latecomer to, I don't mean personally, I mean in terms of the movement of Zionism, a latecomer to the Jewish people. He's somebody that didn't really conceive of himself as committed to it. This was his second or third career. And I think, he's taken by the romance of the thing, taken by the theatricality of it. He produced a play in Brooklyn, for goodness sakes, before this is happening. And to see how this can be, how political ideals and moral motivations and the romance of it all can really inspire someone to mobilize a community. It's a good point. To me, he was a religious man in that sense. The artistry of religion that raises up a community and then is expressed politically is expressed in all of these. So I'm cognizant of time, so I'm keeping it short. But thank you, Rabbi.
Well, thank you. We have about 3 minutes left, and I'm wondering if in about 30 seconds, each of our presenters could share one thought that you would like our attendees, all of whom were about to be engaged in the work of the World Zionist Congress. What would you like them to take away from this session? Just one thought. Dr. Rayfeld, since you're on the screen, what would you like them to carry into the work of ARZENU at the WC Congress next week?
The core idea that we all know, I think, given this is ARZENU, but that love of Israel does not mean love of government, love of politicians, love of policy. We know that in America, where we have core ideals of what it means to love America, freedom, independence, maybe even capitalism. What are the ideals that we love about Israel? I think we do a very poor job of educating about those core ideals, and we leave a next generation to think either you love the government, you love its policies, or you have to separate. Those core ideals of being there for the protection of our historically oppressed people, the flourishing of our culture and religion, and to do so both in pursuit of the universal rights. Those are inspiring ideals of human liberation and a reason to embrace a modern form of Zionism even to today, and even with strong disagreements about government, about people, about policy.
Thank you. Dr. Maurer?
That if all you have in your lexicon or arsenal of Zionist terminology is the thought of Judah Magnus, then you don't have enough. But if you lack this perspective, you lack something very significant. If all we do is engage in the question of the art of the possible, right? We can lose sight of what Martin Buber said, that Jewish politics ought to be the art of the impossible. Our being engaged with the question of what is the great adventure, what is the great possibility, what is the great potential for within the vision of a progressive Judaism, an unfolding historical Judaism that living in Hebrew, living connected to the land, trying to open up our possibilities of expression, what potential is held there, and let's not be so dazzled by the great array of challenges to that we lose sight of that exciting potential.
Thank you very much. Rabbi Avnon Ben-Venistiev, what should we carry into the Congress? Who?
I'd be mute.
For generations in Zionism, for my grandparents, their part of the Zionist project was to establish a country. And then for my parents' generation, it was to actually build all the infrastructure that makes our life worth living in this country. I think for my generation, the project, their part of the project, our part is to actually stay in Israel and continue the linkage to this place. And I'm just asking all of us together, what will be the part in the Zionism project for the next generation, for the Jewish millennials that are actually taking over the era of Zionism? What will be your part of the project of Zionism? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Friends, our time is nearly expired. So let me take these last moments to thank our presenters for their Zionist Torah, which has enriched us and strengthened us as we prepare to do the work of Reform Zionism in the World Zionist Congress. I want to say thank you also to all our delegates, alternates, and observers and friends of ARZENU from around the world who have joined us for this session and who will next week carry our banner into the work of the 38th World Zionist Congress. Lachatz lechem. Here's to your success and to your achievement on behalf of all of us. Shalom.